Well, wonderful. My name's Evan Manville. Thank you all for joining us. I work with the Department of Land Conservation and Development, and I've been facilitating the rulemaking on the process, implementing a bill the legislature passed. If you have any questions during this webinar, feel free to hover over part of your screen and you should pop up an option to chat, and you can just type a message either to the whole group or to the DLCD, send questions here. There are only 8 participants, so it may be possible after the presentation to unmute people and to have you say questions orally, but with a large thing, we found that it's easiest if everyone besides the presenters are muted. With that, I will try to turn it over to Gordon Howard, who's the policy lead on this rulemaking.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Or Evan, can you hear me?
I can hear you. If people can't hear you, they should chat immediately. Type a little chat message to us.
Okay.
Or people want to raise their thumbs. I can see some of you on videos. Raise your thumb. You can hear us.
Okay. I apologize for not being in the conference room in person. For anyone who lives anywhere north of from Wilsonville on north might understand why I'm not in the Salem office this morning or afternoon. But I'm glad to be able to get this done despite the weather issues. As Evan said, this presentation is to discuss and present and get feedback on a rulemaking that is a result of House Bill 4079 passed by the 2016 legislature, which created an affordable housing pilot program and directed the department to write rules to implement that program, and those rules need to be adopted by July 1st, 2017. We, however, have scheduled the rules to be tentatively adopted at the LCDC January meeting in St. Helens in a couple of weeks. If there's a significant issues that still need to be resolved, they can continue that to the March meeting. We wanted to get this rulemaking completed before significantly getting into the 2017 legislative session. So if you want to go to the next slide, Evan. As I said, the overview of our presentation, first of all, we'll talk a bit about the context. Next, the goals of the pilot program, what we want to achieve, our calendar for how the pilot program will go forward, how we want the program to work in terms of both the application and review process, and then how we can get additional input if you're an interested party and want some more information about the program, and then we'll get the end, we'll have some questions. Next slide. First of all, context. The housing market, as you has been a lot of news about, there is a significant housing crisis is the right word, but certainly problem in the state of Oregon, and it is a statewide problem that has arisen since the coming out of the last recession. It's gotten the most press in the Portland metropolitan area, but there are significant housing issues throughout the state. Key statistics there include the fact that a significant number of renters, especially, are paying more than 30% of their income for housing, and that is a standard, a federal standard that indicates whether a household is cost burdened or not. As you can see, extremely low income Oregonians, those of less than 30% or 50% of the median income are paying, almost all of them pay more than half of their income for housing, which is a second definition, severely cost burden, that's used by the Federal Housing and Urban Development Department. We could go to the next slide. Our housing work, DLCD offers, we do offer grants and technical assistance to cities wanting to boost the creation of housing. we're working on a website developing publications on the housing issues that we work with on communities around the state. We hired the University of Oregon to conduct research on housing. Those studies are available on our pilot program page on our website. Also, the Oregon Housing and Community Services Department is drafting a revision to the state housing plan, which hasn't been done in many years. Basically, back to that, we do the basic guideline for our program in terms of housing is found, as you probably know, in Goal 10, which sets forth the requirement that cities provide adequate amounts and types of housing. DLCD and LCDC haven't gotten into as much the issue of affordability per se in terms of the programs involved. That's more done through OHCS and others. But our emphasis has always been on the supply and types of housing that cities should provide to meet their housing needs. Next slide. In terms of the recent legislature in 2016, the legislature passed 4 bills addressing housing issues, which were a major topic in the 2016 short legislative session. This bill, in addition, they passed bills for increasing tenant protections, the inclusionary zoning bill that was passed, authorizing a limited amount of inclusionary zoning requirements in cities around the state, and also housing was a lot of the issue behind the passage of the limitation of voter approval of city annexations that the legislature adopted as well. Next slide. House Bill 4079, which we're talking about today, the basic issue is, do urban growth boundaries increase housing prices? There are mixed academic studies on this subject. It's been a subject of controversy pretty much since the program began over 40 years ago now. As I said, there have been studies back and forth on the issue, and really that's not what we're dealing with here today. We're dealing with a test essentially of the idea that urban growth boundaries have increased land prices to the point where affordable housing is not feasible. The hypothesis behind the bill is that if urban growth boundary rules that are normally in place governing such expansions of UGBs are relaxed to bring in land that would not otherwise be urbanized, then the lower cost of that land, because it wasn't planned to be urbanized, will allow essentially a margin or an increment of financial ability to set aside some of the housing that is built on that land for affordable housing, and then that will make the affordable housing component of the land added become feasible financially. This whole bill is based upon an attempt to test that hypothesis to see if it is correct. Next slide. The overall goals of the pilot program are to increase the amount of affordable housing, not only as a result of expansions of the urban growth boundary, but also within existing urban growth boundaries in the city. The bill is intended to encourage cities to provide for more land for affordable housing and needed housing within existing urban growth boundaries development. And then in addition, looking at, through this urban growth boundary expansion idea, the ability to reduce land prices to make affordable housing more feasible in those areas. And the whole point of this bill is a pilot program, which we'll get into in a minute, is to enhance the understanding of the relationship of land supply to affordable housing, both within and without, or in areas that an urban growth boundary is going to be expanded. And so if we could go to the next slide. Our calendar for the pilot program is, first of all, we've had, this slideshow was originally given in 2016, so the June through November, it deals with 2016. We had a rulemaking advisory committee that had worked with us to create the draft rules that the commission will consider at their meeting in a couple weeks, which, as you can see, is in January 26th in St. Helens. The LCDC meeting will be there. It is a public hearing. We encourage you, if you have an interest, to provide testimony either in writing or in person orally. The rule will take effect once the commission adopts those rules, perhaps in January, perhaps in March. The deadline for adoption of those rules is July 1st. We see no problem in meeting that deadline. We'll talk about what these pre-applications and full applications mean later, but the idea is that we'll have a pre-application process for cities sometime in the summer or fall. Those will be due later, several months later. The full applications will be due. And then in 2018, the Commission will review the applications and select the projects that they want to go, the two projects, as we'll talk about, that will go forward as pilots to work on this concept. We can go to the next. By the way, those deadlines are at the discretion of the director, and the director has flexibility, if our draft rules are adopted as is, to adjust those deadlines to deal with changing circumstances. If, for instance, it's taking longer for cities to get the materials together to do the applications, the director has the ability to extend those deadlines as necessary. The next slide. The basic pilot program is that there will be two pilot projects, one for a city of less than 25,000 population and one for a city greater than 25,000 population, that will be selected by the Land Conservation Development Commission to go forward. The purpose of the projects are to develop affordable and needed housing on land currently outside urban growth boundaries. The bill specifically, and this is from the legislation, specifically limits eligibility and states that none of the three metro counties, Polk County, Marion County, or essentially Jefferson County, none of the cities within those counties can apply to be part of this pilot project. Next slide. The overall process that the rules envision is, first of all, there would be a pre-application with some basic information from cities that are interested in going forward with a full application. The department would review those applications and work with the cities. It is our intent to have this be not a process of you submit this and we will review it and then make a decision. We want to work interactively and collaboratively with cities in preparing their applications to ensure that we get the best projects going forward, and we intend to do that. We will provide staff resources to review and work with the cities on the pre-applications, and then once that's done, the cities that want to go forward will then submit a final application, which is the third step. After that, then we get into a more formal review process where the department will review the applications to make sure the basic qualifications are met. There are provisions for additional, if you will, bonus points, abilities for applications. Hopefully we'll get multiple applications in these categories. And cities will want to have either provisions for the city to provide additional benefits that would cause the commission to select that project over others that are submitted. But anyway, the LCDC will hold public hearings and select two projects, one for a large city, one for a small city. And then there are a series of provisions in the rules for what happens after that in terms of the requirements of the cities to move forward with their projects, and then reporting requirements, because one of the important, as we said, one of the important items of this proposal is that, or these rules are that we gain information resulting from the pilot projects. Because clearly the point of a pilot project is to see whether this concept has validity and should be at some point at the discretion of the legislature, which would have to pass a bill, whether this concept would go forward and have more general application throughout the state. We can go to the next slide. First of all, back to the pre-application conference, the first step. We will be providing a packet and samples of pre-application materials to cities well before the deadline that's set. The basic material that would be in the pre-application are, first of all, a site map, total acreage of the proposal, which we'll get to cannot be greater than 50 acres. Current land use designation zoning, a demonstration that there's no high-value farmland. That is a requirement of the statute, that the land that's brought in cannot be high-value farmland. Then the proposed number of affordable housing units, the type of units. the project, excuse me, the legislation specifically authorizes the commission to consider mixed income projects. In other words, a mix of affordable and market rate units. And so information on both the amount and type of affordable and market rate units proposed. A very important point, the identity of development partners the city has come forward with. We suspect and highly believe that the city, most cities are not in the actual development business. They will need to have a partner, either a for-profit developer, a nonprofit housing provider, or both as our partners. So the city needs to work on that, and we want that information as part of the pre-application conference, at least a pre-application process, at least some ideas going forward that can be fleshed out. And finally, a brief statement about how public facilities and services will be made available to the project site. Next slide. Next will be the department review of those pre-applications. As we talked about, we will be talking to each applicant, working with them. We may ask for additional information. We intend, as I said, this to be an iterative, collaborative process with the cities to get to a point where they're comfortable with their applications that they'll be submitting, and we're comfortable that those applications will meet the basic requirements and be the best possible projects going forward. Next slide. As we said, once the pre-application conference is complete, a city at its discretion may decide or can decide to submit a final application, which will provide a lot more detailed information. The basic requirement is, and it's called for in the legislation, is to provide a concept plan with, once again, the proposed affordable and market rate units, number and type, the phasing of the development. There's also some requirements there that we'll get into. The income limits for the affordable housing, we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then also a list of what will need to be amended in their comprehensive plan and land use regulations to implement the project. Next slide. Additional material that will be needed is more information on the public facilities and services, and we'll get into the more detailed requirements for that later. Similarly, we'll get into more detailed requirements about required buffering from farm and forest zones that remain outside the urban growth boundary, resolution of any natural resources on site, essentially Goal 5 resources such as wetlands, natural areas, the same as with any other urban growth boundary expansion proposal. Any location of natural hazards, if part of the site's in the special flood hazard area, and any protection or mitigation measures that are necessary in that regard. If we go to the next slide. Other items of the final application, first of all, a resolution from the city, clearly that it's going to implement the plan and annex the site within 2 years if it's selected. The city is the applicant, not the county or other parties, but we need a resolution of support from the county in which the proposal is located, so that we know that the county, because obviously a subsequent urban growth boundary amendment has to be adopted by both the city and the county, so that we need to know that the county supports the effort. Very importantly, a resolution of support from any special district that provides services at this time to the area, not necessarily even one that will be providing services. There was some discussion about this, that special districts that will be providing services or will be affected by the expansion of the urban growth boundary need to show that they support the proposal as well. Consent from any property owners involved, that's a fairly obvious requirement. We'll get into a list of housing measures that have been adopted within the existing urban growth boundary. We'll be talking about that a little later as well. Some data about how the project will serve those in need of affordable housing and why the project development won't happen elsewhere. These are intended to be fairly generalized statements. They're not going to be required to be a lot of detailed analysis there. These are requirements in the statute, but we don't expect that we're going to be requiring a lot of detailed findings, just some basic information on these two items. Also, the identity and experience of the development partners for the city. This is very important to have this all completed before as part of the final application, so the commission will know who's behind who's working with the city on the development. because that is actually an item for which the city, the commission will need to make a finding that those development partners are able and willing, or obviously willing, but able to complete the project. And then finally, this is straight from the statute as well, a requirement that the affordable housing will stay affordable as such for at 50 years. It's actually at least 50 years. Occasionally these are done in perpetuity, but we want to make sure that that housing, that's the affordable housing provided as for the project, remains affordable for a very long period of time. And that, as I said, is part of the statutory requirement. Next slide. The next part of the process, the department will determine upon receiving the final applications if the application meets the basic qualifications. And then, if necessary, we can solicit additional information to make sure that we determine that the basic qualifications are met, and also what additional incentives or ideas to make the project even better, additional information regarding those as well. Next slide. Now we're going to get into the basic requirements, the substantive requirements, if you will, for the actual applications. First of all, the project site has to be adjacent to the current urban growth boundary. It can't be on high-value farmland, and as we talked about, the commission will be defining high-value farmland, and we're proposing to use the definition in Chapter 195, which is a more up-to-date definition of what constitutes high-value farmland, than the one in Chapter 215. For those of you who are rural policy wonks, other than that, we'll leave that one for now. The site cannot be larger than 50 acres. We have a requirement that the dwelling units per acre at a gross level be at least 7 dwelling units per acre for both the affordable units and the market rate units. That still doesn't preclude single family or single detached dwellings, but those would need to be at a fairly high density for that. We'd like to see that this is clearly intended to be affordable or market, and the market rate in affordable housing to be at a higher density than is sometimes seen at the fringes of urban development of areas. In addition, we received input, as we'll talk about in a minute when we get to facilities. There is a requirement that there be public transit available to the area, and we received input from transit providers that 7 units per acre, a gross acre, was a minimum density generally necessary to provide public transit to an area. Also, information that the project would not be likely be developed within the urban growth boundary, maybe a bit of financial information there. This is very important, the last 2 items. The bill specifically, and the rules specifically exempt the proposal from any findings relating to Goal 14, relating to ORS 197A.320, which governs location of land that's added to the urban growth boundary. In other words, both the 20-year need requirements that are standard for regular urban growth boundary amendments, and the location factors that avoid farmland and forest land and direct the expansions onto higher priority exception land or urban reserves are all waived. They're waived by the bill, and they're waived by these rules. In addition, there are no findings required for goals 9, 10, and 12. With the idea that the other information that's provided as part of this application will substitute for those goals. That's economic development, housing, and transportation. And then all the other goals are also waived with 3 exceptions. Goal 5, as we talked about earlier, we still need to know if for instance, there are wetlands on the site that will impact the development. That's not waivable. Findings need to provide for that. Goal 7, hazards. We need to know if the site has, what the most likely one would be if it's in the special flood hazard area, or part of it is, and how that will be avoided or mitigated. And finally, there are requirements of compliance with Goal 11, the public facilities goal, but only in terms of the impact of the pilot project on the existing UGB. In other words, we want to know that the additional sewer service that will be provided for the 50-acre site won't overtax the existing city's sewer treatment plant? Those kind of questions. But those are the only goal findings that are necessary for the application. All the normal ones regarding urban growth boundaries are pretty much waived. Next slide. Additional basic requirements that public facilities and services can be reasonably provided. We'll get to that. That there is a transit to the site or a service commitment for transit to serve public transit to serve the site. There's a requirement that cities over 25,000 population, it must be fixed route transit. But for cities under 25,000, we would accept, I forget now the official term, but the unofficial term is the dial-a-ride type services. I think demand response services is what is the official term. There is a requirement that a project be buffered from land and farm and forest zones outside the urban growth boundary that remain outside by at least 100 feet of a buffer on the site, or an alternative method that provides equal or greater protection. As we said, you still are required to apply Goal 5 for natural resources to the project site. And then there is a requirement that the city provide affordable and needed housing within the urban growth boundary through certain measures, and we'll get to that in a minute. Next slide. That is the topic of the next slide. Efforts to encourage affordable and needed housing within the existing urban growth boundary. We prepared a list of, I believe it's over 20 affordable and needed housing measures, and they're in the rule. They're also taken from work that we had done for working on, for those of you who are familiar with it, the simplified urban growth boundary process that we completed last year. And the idea is that of these measures, which are given points, and it's all set out in the rule, I think there's 53, we've got about 53 possible points for these 20-some measures. Some measures are considered more effective than others. A city has to show that it has, as part of its application, already adopted measures within its code or other local provisions that equal at least 12 of those 53 total points, and at least 6 of those points have to be for actual affordable housing measures. And without getting into a lot of detail here, the kind of measures, affordable housing measures, would include density bonus provisions, reductions in system development charges for affordable housing, adoption of one of the or several of the various property tax exemption or freeze measures that are authorized in state law, inclusionary zoning, a construction excise tax. Those are the kind of affordable housing measures. Needed housing measures are things involving accessory dwelling units, minimum density standards, lower off-street parking requirements, skinny streets. They're all set forth pretty clearly in the draft rule if you want to take a look at that in more detail. I think that we've also prepared a chart of these measures on the rulemaking website. What a city would need to do if it didn't have enough measures adopted before the application, it would need to adopt some of those measures to get up to the minimum requirements. Also, we would hope that cities would have more than the minimum number of measures required that already adopted or soon to be adopted, so that that would be a positive aspect for a city trying to compete with other cities to be nominated, to have their nominations selected. This is all in here, and this may be a bit of a heavy lift for some cities and not for others, but this is all in here because it is required in the legislation that a city show that it is working not only to add this land to the urban growth boundary for affordable housing, but provide that needed and affordable housing boost within its existing urban growth boundary. And that's the whole point of this perhaps somewhat complicated list of measures, is to have cities demonstrate that they're not putting all of their eggs in the affordable housing basket of this one project site outside the urban growth boundary currently. They're also working to provide that housing within the existing urban growth boundary as well. We go to the next slide. Additional housing requirements, and these are in terms of the mixed income issue, mix of affordable and market rate housing. At least 30% of the units in the development have to be affordable, and that's defined in the bill, in the rules, excuse me, as affordable being for households that earn up to 80% of area median income, and those households would need to spend less than 30% of their income on housing. In other words, they would not be cost burdened. The 80% figure, we looked at existing affordable housing programs, and while some have lower thresholds, some of them, the maximum they go up to is that 80% figure. The 30% of units being affordable, our rulemaking advisory committee had an awful lot of discussion on this issue. It was probably the biggest point of contention. And this figure was, I think it's safe to say, a compromise from those who wanted higher percentages required or versus lower percentages. It's very important, though, that that 30% is a minimum, and if a city is able or willing to provide, or a developer for that matter that's working with the city is able to provide a greater percentage of affordable housing as part of the development, I think it's safe to say our commission, if it sees several applications, will weight very heavily applications that provide additional affordable housing above the minimum 30%. There's an additional controversy at this point, and I think it's the one issue that the Rulemaking Advisory Committee didn't come to consensus on, is whether the 80% figure of area median income should be re-raised to 100% potentially for sale affordable housing projects. And we would certainly be interested in any input any of you had on that topic as well. And also, we got some testimony from individuals and some information that indicated that manufactured home parks, which are specifically allowed as one of the housing types that could be considered as part of this proposal. I mean, there's some idea that a manufactured home park might be an ideal housing type on the edge of an urban growth boundary for an affordable housing project. But the idea that those manufactured home parks should also be at up to 100% of area median income to qualify as affordable housing. The Commission will have to resolve that issue at their rulemaking hearing. There are also requirements relating to scale that the housing requirements, at least 10 units for smaller cities and 20 units for larger cities, be affordable housing. And finally, we would need to see a phasing plan that ensured that the affordable housing is built concurrently or in phases concurrent with or equal with the market rate housing. So we don't get the issue of a project being approved, the market rate housing being built, and the affordable housing coming much later or not at all. We can go to the next slide. Additional housing requirements are that if there are any common amenities in the development, that they be accessible to both affordable and market rate units to avoid the poor door problem, as it's sometimes called. As all the units would be affordable for 50 years, the city is going to need to provide kind of a draft of the document it will be using to ensure most likely a contractual arrangement to ensure that the 50-year affordability requirement is met. There's a requirement that none of the units in the development, either affordable or market rate, can be available to be used for vacation or short-term rental use. The city will need to, if it doesn't have it already, adopt codes to ensure that. And also some indication that, as I stated earlier, the development partners can complete the project. This is a very important aspect that came out in our Rulemaking Advisory Committee, that we want to see that basic requirement that there's evidence in the record and from the past experience, perhaps, of the development partners or the financial capabilities that they can complete the project as proposed. Next slide. And as I said earlier, the Commission has the ability, when looking at multiple applications that meet the basic requirements, to look at selection considerations above and beyond those basic requirements. Those include, as I stated earlier, the total number and percentage of affordable units. If Project A provides 30% of the units affordable and Project B provides 50%, Project B would be considered in a better light by the Commission. Another aspect, if the project proposed units reserved for at income levels lower than 80% of area median income, 60%, 50%, 30%. There are programs that, existing programs that have those kind of levels as well. That would be a positive factor. Also, if the development and reserves units for, and it's sometimes erroneously called workforce housing, but essentially more middle income housing of between 80 and 100% at 20% of area median income. In other words, not within the affordable, but reserved for somewhat higher incomes. That would be a positive factor as well. As I said earlier, if the city has adopted measures for housing inside the urban growth boundary beyond those minimum requirements set forth in the rule, they've adopted 30 points versus measures instead of 12. The proximity or expense of the public facilities or services that are needed to provide the site, the information provided by the cities will allow that determination. The quality of the facilities proposed for walking, biking, and transit as part of the application. The quality of the efforts to avoid impacts on farm and forest zones, we talked about that, and also avoiding impacts on natural resources, and a more general requirement that that's something that will best meet the purposes of the pilot program. And that's kind of a catch-all. Perhaps it's a housing type that's unusual or provide information that we don't have about feasibility of affordable housing. We wanted to make sure that the Commission has some discretion in that area. Next slide. Once the Commission gets the applications and has the public hearing and makes its selection based upon those basic criteria and then the additional considerations, as I said, the Commission will make a selection of 2 pilot projects. At that point, the cities, and that's a preliminary selection, the city needs to provide some additional information, particularly the documents that it'll be using to ensure the site remains affordable. In other words, what kind of deed restriction contractual arrangement is being proposed, and kind of essentially the form of that needs to be provided at that point. And that's only by essentially the winning cities. The cities that weren't selected, didn't have to do that work. A commission will review that. Once it's satisfactory, it will issue a final order for the 2 cities. At that point, it's incumbent of the city and the county to amend the urban growth boundary, the city to annex the site, as it's stated, within 2 years of the selection. The city needs to adopt the measures that will ensure that the project gets implemented with the affordability provisions, the planned zone designations, and issue the permits through development. Will have to go through its, I'm sure it will have to go through its local approval process for that. And there's a key point, and this is straight from the statute. If at any point during this period the project is determined to be infeasible, in other words, perhaps the landowner changes his or her mind, and no longer consents. I mean, we can see that happening potentially, unless it wasn't, locked down, or there becomes local controversy during the application process for the subdivision. If that happens, this project site becomes infeasible. The city and the county need to remove that site from the urban growth boundary. It can't be used for other urban purposes, and that's a key point, because if it could, that price differential that we're talking about might disappear. The whole point of the price differential is that the site is brought in the UGB under certain specific conditions, and only those conditions. And if it's not developed with a project that's seen by the Commission and approved by the Commission as part of the pilot project, it's not going to be developed in an urban way, and it needs to be removed from the urban growth boundary at that point. Next slide. Finally, the last part of the rules deal with reporting requirements. The city is going to need, and working with the development partners, to provide information about projected and actual costs of the development, and then for a period of 10 years, how the project has progressed. Affordable units, the vacancy rate for those units, the market rate units, the monthly rent or sales prices, and this is a very important point, any additional affordable housing incentives or subsidies applied. In other words, if there is an affordable housing subsidy of a tax credit that's in addition to the urban growth boundary, the cost differential, the land that involved the urban growth boundary amendment, we need to know that, because we want to make sure that the reason the affordable housing got developed was because of this differential in the urban growth boundary and the urban land price, related to the urban growth boundary, not for other purposes or other reasons. And also the housing measures for land inside the urban growth boundary that are adopted or amended. and a qualitative assessment of how the project went forward. And the next slide. So that's really going through in a whirlwind the rules. I think it's very important to see what the next steps are for interested cities. First of all, double check to confirm your city is eligible. Secondly, review the list of measures to encourage affordable and needed housing and consider adoption of additional measures. If the city doesn't have the minimum number of points needed, what additional measures would be feasible. And the point of having all this list of measures, options, is that we would like cities, give cities the option of choosing measures that are most appropriate for those cities, both for physical features or for landforms or even for policy or political reasons. The city should see how the rules adopted. We reach out to potential partners, the special districts, the counties, the development partners that would be interested, and stay in touch with us. And I'm the point person, so if you have any questions or want to know what's going on, let me know. The key thing I want to emphasize is that these rules, we want the rules to result in applications. We want to see multiple applications from cities for each of these two categories. If that doesn't happen, we don't want it to be because the rules were too onerous or strict or complicated. We want a fair process to see that to give this concept a chance to see if it will work. And the point of the rules is to provide a framework for that encourages cities, not discourage cities from applying and considering this program and deciding whether it works for their city. Next slide. Okay, we're into the questions segment. You want to take this over, Evan?
Sure. If people have questions, now is a great time to ask them. And I haven't seen anyone type a question to everyone using the chat function. People are struggling with that. I'm also inclined, given that we only have 11 people on the phone, to unmute everyone in case people want to ask a oral question. So I'm just trying to figure out how to do that.
Why don't we do that? And if anyone gets unruly, we'll have to. Please don't get unruly on us.
Hey, Gordon, this is John Morgan. I have a question.
Hi, John.
Hi. Maybe I missed this. So clarify it, if you will, please. It seems that what you were saying is that this is pretty focused on a site-specific UGB expansion where that expansion area and even its development capability and capacity are already known going into this. Instead of identifying a need for a UGB expansion and then going through this process to find and target the most appropriate site. Am I reading that right?
Yes, John. Assuming everyone heard the question, yes, you are correct. This is a site-specific proposal.
Okay.
It involves a compliant, a consenting landowner and all that up to 50 acres.
Yeah, okay.
It's aimed at a specific site, not a more general study of an area.
Yeah, which also really means that landowner has to be committed to the program.
That's correct.
Okay. That might end up being limiting, but we'll see how that works.
Landowners sometimes have different ideas of what to do. That is.
Well, I've got 2 target communities that seem to be fairly interested, but they don't have sites in mind yet. So I don't know that they're going to be ready or even willing to participate because of that. So we'll see what happens. Thanks.
That might be a good reason to extend our deadlines if a lot of cities are dealing with it.
Okay.
Other people have questions? Okay, I'm seeing.
Max, Glenn, can you hear me?
Yes, now we can. Thanks, Max.
Yes. Max Glenn, does the community land trust model work for the 50-year protection?
Matt, in answer to your question, I'm not exactly familiar with the city land trust model, but it is a guarantee that provides if it can't be gotten out of legally, then certainly it would qualify.
Yes. Well, we have a Lincoln County community land trust that we're a part of, and so we would want to.
Yeah, I think I'd have to check on that, but my understanding of the community land trust, what I know on the topic would qualify. And the main thing is that there's legal guarantee that, and it doesn't have to be only 50 years. It could be much, it could be in perpetuity or a longer period, but that's the minimum.
Understand. Thank you.
Anyone else have questions? If not, we are always available. Well, we are here for you as questions come up. If you go further, both Gordon and I are available. Gordon's the main contact. I hope most of you, if not all of you, have been receiving emails about the program. If you have not, then please let me know. I'm Evan Manvell, and we'll put you on the interested parties list. We are continually trying to make sure everyone who might be interested in the program is up to speed and is giving us all the feedback we need to make sure it's as most successful as possible. We did recently send a survey out with just a few questions, but it is relatively urgent if you have suggestions for improving the rules, that you get us those suggestions ASAP. That is before the commission hearing on at the end of January. So yeah, here's Gordon's email address. If you want to
I have a question.
on the draft rule, that's email it to Amy. All of our materials are available on the rulemaking website, which I will pull up here for people's interest, hopefully.
Evan, did I hear someone say they had a question?
Yeah, I just have a question. I just am curious what, this is Garrett Jensen. I'm curious what went into the decision making behind not allowing communities in Yamhill, or I'm sorry, Marion and Polk counties not to be eligible
Well,
for the program?
Well, Garrett, that's a very good question, and you have to probably ask your state legislators why that was made. I assume that there was some concern about something going on in Marion and Polk counties. Salem straddles the boundary of that's nothing to do with the city of Salem. I haven't answered that, but so there's no leeway on that. So the only way this is for Marion and Polk counties is at some point the legislature be more generous provision. But that's obviously most likely years away if it happens at all.
And before I give anyone else a chance for questions, here are some materials that we hope will be useful for you. We have the draft rule language, as well as a one-page overview of all those housing measures that you need to take some of, and then kind of one-page flowcharts or summaries of how the process works and how the selection works, as well as some kind of more technical questions from the December webinar, and a copy of the presentation. That's all available on our website. Any other questions? hearing.
Are you recording this webinar so others could hear it?
We are hopefully recording it. We tried last time and failed. The little record button has been going during this webinar. So after this webinar, I will stop it and we will see what we have. If we're successful, it will appear on this website that you have in front of you. So the answer is hopefully yes.
Evan, just a caution on that. Make sure you don't turn it off right away. There was a problem with that at one point. So check with, Mandy or whatever.
Okay, so you maybe a 4-hour recording. No, I'm kidding. Yes, so we will endeavor to, and if you are on the interested parties list, we will email out a note letting you know when it's available. Again, if you're not on the interested, if you haven't been getting emails from me, drop a line to Gordon or to me, evan.mandl@state.org.us. Any final questions for the good of the order or the bad of the order, or time to go play in the snow for those who have it?
Well, thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Gordon.
Okay.
Thanks, Evan.
Thank you. We certainly appreciate everyone's interest and hope people will apply.
Okay.
Thank you. Well, yeah, everyone can hang up except me, who's trying to make sure the recording works.
I guess I need to hang up. Get off.
You're still connected one way or the other, Sharon. We'll monitor that. So go here. Did it stop recording?
I think so, and then it should give you a prompt. Maybe stop recording.